My billionaire ex-husband recruited my hidden son as his personal assistant, blind to the fact he was his own blood. The realization hit me like cold water the morning I saw Jackson's name on the official Harrington Global onboarding list. My coffee cup slipped in my hands. I caught it, but barely. My son, my secret, walking straight into the empire of the man who had no idea he existed. You have his hands, you know. The quiet observation came from Daniel Voss, senior partner at Harrington Global, as he watched the new assistant pour water at the conference table. He was speaking to no one in particular, just thinking aloud, but every word landed on me like a stone dropped in still water. Jackson froze for just a second, barely noticeable, then smiled and set the water jug down without a word. Same hands, same jaw, same quiet intensity behind the eyes. And the man those words were about sat 12 feet away, reviewing contracts, completely unaware that the young man refilling his glass was the son he never knew he had. I'm your host, and today I'm sharing the story of a woman who made an impossible choice 22 years ago, and then watched that choice walk back into her life wearing her ex-husband's face. When her son was recruited as his father's personal assistant, she had days, maybe hours, before the truth she had buried for 2 decades came breathing to the surface. Some secrets refuse to stay hidden, and some truths arrive exactly when they're supposed to, whether we're ready for them or not. If stories about love, loss, and the families we break and rebuild speak to something in your heart, subscribe to this channel right now. There are more stories waiting for you. Stories that will make you question, feel, and maybe even heal. Nadia Carver had not planned to be at that hotel lobby when the announcement was made. She had been invited as a guest speaker at a finance summit. Ironic given that she had built her entire second life trying to stay as far from the world of corporate finance as possible. She had walked away from that world once. She had walked away from a man who lived and breathed it. She had walked away from a version of herself she no longer recognized. And she had done it quietly, carefully, completely. Until the morning she saw her son's name on a lanyard badge being prepared at the registration desk of Harrington Global's annual leadership summit. Jackson Carver, executive assistant trainee, direct placement under CEO Sebastian Harrington. She had stood in that lobby for 4 full minutes, unable to move, the badge sitting on the table like a grenade. Then she had walked to the nearest restroom, run cold water over her wrist, and told herself to breathe. Sebastian Harrington was the man she had once loved more than she thought it was possible to love another human being. He was also the man who had slowly, deliberately, and without even realizing it, begun erasing her. Not with cruelty, with certainty, with the quiet arrogance of someone who believed his vision for their life together was the only vision worth having. She had left him 23 years ago with nothing but a suitcase, her maiden name, and a secret she had not yet discovered she was carrying. Jackson did not know any of this. He had grown up believing his father was a good man who simply hadn't been built for fatherhood, someone who had made his choices early and moved on. Nadia had never spoken Sebastian's name in their home. She had crafted a story careful enough to be believed, vague enough to ask no questions, and kind enough that Jackson had never grown up angry. He had simply grown up without. And somehow in that absence, he had become exactly the kind of man his mother had always prayed he would be. Steady, brilliant, and good in a way that had nothing to do with money or power. And now he was about to spend the next 3 months as the personal assistant of the father who did not know he was alive. If you've ever carried a secret so long it became part of the weight of your bones, you know what Nadia felt standing in that hotel lobby. And if you've ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and telling them the truth, hit that like button right now. Because this story is about exactly that impossible choice and what happens when the universe makes it for you. Nadia first met Sebastian Harrington during her final semester of postgraduate study. She was 24, finishing a thesis on economic inequality in emerging markets. He was 28, already running a boutique investment consultancy he had built from nothing, and already, though she did not know it yet, on a path that would consume everything around him. Their meeting was unremarkable in the way that all life-changing meetings are. A mutual friend's birthday dinner. She was seated across from him. He had argued loudly and incorrectly about a statistical model she had published in a university journal, and she had told him so, quietly and completely, in front of everyone at the table. He had stared at her for a long moment. Then he had laughed. A real laugh, not a polished one, and said she was the first person in 2 years who had spoken to him like a human being. By the end of that dinner, she knew she was in trouble. Their relationship moved fast because everything about Sebastian moved fast. He did not waste time on things he did not believe in, and he believed in Nadia from the very first conversation. He told her she saw the world differently than anyone he had ever met. He asked her opinion on every decision, every deal, every direction he was considering. He made her feel, for the first and perhaps last time in her adult life, that her mind was the most remarkable thing about her. They married 18 months after that first dinner. For the first 2 years, it was everything she had dreamed a partnership could be. She worked alongside him as Harrington Global began its rise. Her analysis shaped 3 of the company's most successful early acquisitions. Her thinking was in the foundation of the business in ways that would never appear in any press release or shareholder report. But she knew, and he knew, and for a long time that was enough. But success, Nadia learned, had a way of changing the shape of a person. Not all at once, slowly, in ways that were easy to excuse, easy to explain away, until the day you looked up and realized the man sitting across from you at the breakfast table was a stranger wearing your husband's face. Sebastian stopped asking her opinion in the 3rd year. Not dramatically, he just stopped. Meetings she had always attended began happening without her. Decisions she had always been part of were made before she walked into the room. When she asked why, he told her she was better suited to the things that mattered more. Building their home, managing their social calendar, being the face of the family they were building together. He said it with warmth. He said it with complete conviction. And that, somehow, made it worse. She remembered the night of Harrington Global's 5th anniversary gala with a sharpness that had never faded. She had overheard him speaking to a journalist near the champagne table. Someone had asked about the secret behind the company's early success. Sebastian had smiled that magnetic smile and said, quite simply, "Behind every great company is a great home. And I've been lucky enough to have a wife who understands that her role is to make sure I can focus on what matters." She had stood behind a pillar and listened to him reduce 20 months of her intellectual contribution to the management of a household. And she had felt something go quiet inside her. Not loud, not dramatic, just gone. The argument that followed when they returned home that night was the first honest conversation they had shared in over a year. She told him what she had heard. He looked genuinely confused. Not guilty, not defensive, genuinely confused, as though the idea that she might want something more than what he was offering was a concept he could not locate in any framework he understood. "I have given you everything," he said. "What are you missing?" That was when she understood that what was broken between them could not be fixed. Not because he was cruel, but because he could not see it. The man she had fallen in love with had been replaced, degree by degree, by someone who measured the worth of things, including the worth of people, entirely by how they served his purpose. 2 weeks after that conversation, before she had found the words to begin leaving, she discovered she was pregnant. She told no one, not her mother, not her closest friend Priya, who had been urging her to leave for nearly a year. She sat with the information alone for 3 days, turning it over in the silence of the home that no longer felt like hers. And then she made her decision. She would leave. She would not tell Sebastian. And she would raise this child the way she had always believed a child deserved to be raised. Free to become whatever they were, without the weight of someone else's vision pressing down on them from the very first breath. She was 30 years old. She had a small amount of savings, a postgraduate degree, and the particular kind of clarity that only comes from having nothing left to lose. She left on a Tuesday. She took her clothes, her files, her laptop, and the ring her grandmother had given her. She left everything else. She changed her phone number that afternoon, changed her address by the end of the week, and began the slow, quiet work of becoming a woman who belonged entirely to herself. Jackson was born 6 months later, 8 pounds, 4 ounces, with his father's hands and his mother's stubbornness. She held him in that hospital room alone and made him a promise. She would tell him everything when he was old enough to understand. She would not let him grow up in ignorance, just in safety, just in peace. That promise she had kept him perfectly. She had told him the shape of the truth without the name inside it. A marriage that ended before he was born. A father who was not built for staying. A clean break made for clean reasons. Jackson had accepted this, the way children accept the things they are given. Not without questions, but without cruelty. He had asked once when he was 12 whether his father knew about him. She had said no. He had nodded, looked out the window for a long time, and then asked what was for dinner. She had loved him so completely in that moment that it had taken her breath away. He had grown up asking for very little and achieving a great deal. He had earned a scholarship to study business and economics, graduated near the top of his cohort, and secured the Harrington Global placement entirely on his own merits through a competitive national program that selected 6 candidates from across thousands of applicants. He had called her from outside the program offices, voice cracking with disbelief and pride, and she had sat on her kitchen floor and wept with a mixture of joy and terror she had no words to describe. 3 days before Jackson was due to begin, Nadia met her friend Priya for lunch at the small cafe where they had been meeting for 15 years. She told her everything. The placement. Sebastian. The fact that Jackson didn't know. Priya had set down her fork very carefully and looked at her for a long time. "You need to tell him," she said, "before he walks into that building. Before he meets that man without knowing what he's walking into." Nadia had turned her cup into circles on the table. "I know." "Then why haven't you?" "Because every time I open my mouth, I see his face. That face when he called me from outside those offices. That pride. I can't be the person who makes this complicated for him before it's even begun." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, "It's already complicated, Nadia. It has been for 22 years. The only question is whether you let him be blindsided or whether you give him the chance to choose." Nadia had known her friend was right. She had known it with the particular certainty of someone who has already decided not to act on what they know. She had told herself she would speak to Jackson that evening. Then he had arrived home excited, carrying printed research on Harrington Global's investment history, already the most prepared person in any room he would ever walk into, and she had said nothing. She told herself she would tell him in the morning. Then the morning came and he was already gone, tie slightly crooked, bag over one shoulder, turning to wave at her from the street with that smile. Sebastian's smile. She had never been able to look at it too long. And the moment passed again, and then the first day was done, and the second, and the third, and the truth she had carried for 22 years was still sitting in her chest where it had always lived. Jackson Turner stepped into the Harrington Global headquarters on a Monday morning and felt for the first time in his young life that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The building was everything the company's reputation suggested. Glass and steel and quiet efficiency, every surface communicating the weight of the things decided inside it. He was processed through security, met by the training coordinator, and introduced to the 5 other candidates who would be rotating through the mentorship program alongside him. Sebastian Harrington arrived at the orientation session 12 minutes in, with no apology for being late and no need to give one. At 54, he had the kind of presence that rearranged a room simply by entering it. His hair had gone silver at the temples. The lines around his eyes were deep, and the eyes themselves were the same blue-gray that Jackson saw in the mirror every morning. Though Jackson had no framework yet to understand why that felt familiar. He welcomed the candidates briefly, precisely, with the warmth of someone who had learned that efficiency and humanity were not mutually exclusive. When his gaze moved around the table and landed on Jackson, something in it paused. A fraction of a second, barely visible, before moving on. Jackson was assigned to shadow Sebastian directly beginning the following day. He had expected the rotation to begin somewhere further down the hierarchy. He had not expected to be placed first. He had not expected on his second morning to arrive at 6:45 and find the CEO already at his desk, working in silence, 3 empty coffee cups suggesting he had been there since before dawn. "Mr. Carver," Sebastian said, without looking up, Coffee is on the sideboard. Black, no sugar if you're having one. Jackson poured 2 cups, noting as he did that he took his the same way. Sit. Sebastian finally looked up. Today you'll observe the quarterly review, take notes on the board preparation meeting, and assist with the infrastructure proposal I'll be presenting Thursday. I expect you to absorb, to think, and to ask questions only when the question would change something. Understood? Understood, sir. Sebastian studied him for a moment. There was something in that study. Not warmth exactly, but attention, the kind that felt different from ordinary professional scrutiny. Your application included a market analysis you wrote independently, the one on sustainable capital allocation in post-disruption economies. Yes. Who taught you to think that way? My mother, Jackson said. She's a financial consultant. She always said numbers are a language. And like any language, you have to understand what's being left unsaid. Sebastian was still for a moment. Then he nodded once and returned to his documents. The days that followed built themselves into a rhythm that felt, to Jackson, almost uncanny in its ease. He anticipated Sebastian's requests before they were made. He structured reports in the same framework Sebastian preferred, arrived at the same conclusions through the same logic, flagged the same risks in the same order. It was efficient. It was, by every measure, a professional success. And it was deeply, quietly strange. Olivia Park, the HR coordinator who managed the trainee program, pulled him aside at the end of his second week. You know, it usually takes the trainees 2 months to sync with him, she said. Some never do. He's particular. You two work like you've been doing this together for years. Jackson had smiled and attributed it to good preparation, but in the privacy of his own thoughts, he couldn't entirely explain it either. He began to notice things, the way Sebastian tapped 2 fingers on the table when thinking through a problem. Jackson had been doing that his whole life and had always thought it was just a habit. The way they both aligned objects on a desk to precise angles without thinking about it. The way they both went quiet at the same moments in a conversation and returned to speech with the same rhythm. He filed these observations away without knowing what to do with them. They sat in the back of his mind like a word he couldn't quite remember. 3 weeks into the placement in the executive dining room, Daniel Voss set down his tea and looked between Jackson and Sebastian, who was working across the room unaware, and said quietly and with complete certainty, "You have his hands, you know. Same hands, same jaw. It's remarkable." Jackson had set down the water jug. His heart was doing something loud and irregular. "Just a coincidence," he said. "People say that," Daniel replied, "but coincidences don't usually come with the same voice patterns, the same way of standing, and the same habit of solving a problem out loud by asking a question." He picked up his tea again. Not my business, of course. He left it there, and Jackson stood in the middle of that room for a long moment before he found his legs again. That night he called his mother. "Mom," he said, laughing because the alternative was something he wasn't ready for. "You won't believe what one of the senior partners said today. He said I have Sebastian Harrington's hands. He said we look alike." He laughed again, waiting for her to laugh with him. She didn't. The silence on the other end of the line was not the silence of someone reaching for a response. It was the silence of someone who had been waiting, for a very long time, to run out of time. "Jackson," she said finally, "I need you to come home. If you've ever had the feeling that the ground beneath you was about to shift, that the story you'd been living was about to become a different story entirely, then you understand exactly what Jackson felt in that moment. And if you've ever been the person holding the secret that causes that shift, you understand Nadia. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep hearing stories about the impossible weight of love and the complicated grace of truth, because there are so many more where this one came from." He drove to her apartment in under an hour. She was sitting at the kitchen table when he arrived, the same table where he had done homework, celebrated birthdays, cried when things went wrong, and laughed when they went right. She looked older to him in that moment than she ever had. Smaller. Like someone who had been carrying something heavy for so long they had forgotten there was any other way to stand. "Tell me," he said. "All of it. Not the version you gave me when I was 12. She told him. She told him about the dinner, the arguments, the gala, the champagne table. the quiet erosion of herself that had happened so slowly she had almost not noticed it happening. She told him about the morning she discovered she was pregnant, about the Tuesday she left, about the promise she had made him in the hospital when he was 8 pounds and 4 ounces and had no idea what world he had arrived into. She told him everything except the one thing she did not know how to say, and then she said that too. Sebastian Harrington is your father. He doesn't know you exist. I made that choice. I made it for reasons I believed in, and I have lived with it every day since. Jackson sat across from her and did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "So when I called you laughing about a man telling me I looked like my boss, you already knew exactly why?" "Yes. And you've known for 3 weeks that I was working alongside him, and you said nothing." She met his eyes. "I was afraid of taking this from you. The way you felt the morning you got that call. The pride. I didn't want to be the reason that got complicated." He stood up, walked to the window, came back. "Mom," he said, his voice very careful, very controlled. "This isn't yours to protect me from anymore. I'm 22. This is my life, my history, and I deserve to know." She did not argue with him. There was nothing to argue. He asked to be alone for the rest of that night. He drove home, sat in his car outside his building for 40 minutes, and thought about every conversation he had ever had with Sebastian Harrington. Every moment of inexplicable ease, every shared reflex, every mirrored habit, every second of working alongside someone and feeling, without any reason to feel it, that this was familiar, that this fit. He thought about what it meant that the man he had been quietly, privately beginning to admire, not as a CEO, but as a person, was the man his mother had fled across the country to protect him from. He thought about whether he wanted to know more before he decided anything. By morning, he had made a decision. He would continue the program. He would observe. He would understand who Sebastian Harrington was now. Not the man from his mother's story, not the ghost who had shaped her departure, but the man who existed in the present. And then he would choose. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Jackson had experienced. He watched Sebastian with different eyes now. He noticed the way Sebastian listened in meetings, fully, without interrupting, without using the time to prepare his own response. He noticed the way he credited people publicly for their contributions, the junior analysts, the administrative staff, the trainees who most leaders would never acknowledge by name. He noticed the way he handled an error by a first-year associate, not with humiliation, but with patience, and with the kind of feedback that made the associate better instead of smaller. This was not the man his mother had described, or rather, this was a man who had traveled a very long distance from who he had once been. One evening, working late on an international expansion presentation, Sebastian poured 2 glasses of water, pushed one across the desk without being asked, and said with no particular segue, "I was married once, before I built most of this. She was the most intelligent person I had ever met. She left." He paused. "I spent years believing I didn't understand why. It took me considerably longer to admit that I understood perfectly well. I simply hadn't wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. "She deserved better than I gave her, and I have had to live in the knowledge of that for a very long time." Jackson's throat was dry. He took a sip of water. "What was she like?" he asked, because he needed to hear it from this side. "Formidable," Sebastian said simply. Clear-eyed, she saw the truth of a situation before the numbers confirmed it. "We built the early foundation of this company together, though you wouldn't know it from any public record. That's something I'm not proud of." He looked out the window. "The worst thing about the way I behaved then was that I didn't know I was doing it. I believed I was offering her everything. It took losing her, truly, completely, with no possibility of return, to understand what I had actually been offering her was a cage with very nice furnishings." That night, Jackson called his mother. He told her what Sebastian had said. She was silent for a long time. "He told me he regrets it," Jackson said. "Does that mean anything to you?" "People can regret the past," she said quietly, "without having changed the things in them that caused it." "Mom," Jackson said, "do you believe that's true of him?" Or do you believe it because it's easier? She did not answer him, but the silence itself was its own kind of answer. On a gray Wednesday morning, the decision was made for all of them. Marcus. No. Daniel Voss knocked on Sebastian's office door with an expression that Jackson, who had developed a fairly precise read of this building's emotional weather, recognized as serious. Sebastian sent Jackson to collect a file from the research department. When Jackson returned 20 minutes later, Sebastian was standing at the window with his back to the room, very still, in the way that people are still when something has rearranged itself inside them and they haven't yet decided what to do about it. He turned when Jackson entered. "Jackson," he said, "sit down, please." Jackson sat. Sebastian looked at him for a long moment. Really looked, with the kind of attention that searches for something rather than simply sees. "I've just had a conversation that I need to follow through on before I can have one with you." He paused. "Take the rest of the day. I'll be in touch this evening." Jackson went home. He told his mother by text. "I think he knows." She called him immediately. Her voice was steady in the way that voices are steady when they have been preparing for something for a very long time. "I'll be home," she said. "Come when you're ready." That evening, Nadia opened her door to find Sebastian Harrington standing on her threshold for the first time in 23 years. He looked older than the image she had kept in her memory, and somehow more present, more solid. Less like the man from another life, and more like a person who had arrived here through difficulty and was standing in front of her because there was nowhere else to go. "Were you ever going to tell me?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She stepped back to let him in. He walked into her living room and stopped. The walls were covered in photographs. Jackson at 5, at 10, at 16. Jackson at his university graduation. Jackson laughing at a family dinner with people Sebastian had never met. 22 years of a life he had never been given the chance to witness. He stood there looking at them for a long time without speaking. "I thought I was protecting him," Nadia said from behind him. "From what I had seen. From who you were. And who was I?" She told him. Not softly, not with the editing of years. She told him about the gala, about the champagne table, about the morning she had understood that the erosion of herself was not something he had intended, but was something he had done regardless. She told him about the choice she had made and why she had made it, and what it had cost her every day for 22 years to carry it alone. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not defend himself. When she finished, he said, "You were right about who I was, and I am sorry. Not as an argument, not as a request. Just as a fact that deserved to be spoken." She had not expected that. She had armored herself for anger, for accusation, for the complicated machinery of grievance. She had not armored herself for simplicity. Her eyes filled with tears she refused to release. "Does he know?" Sebastian asked. "About me?" She nodded. 2 weeks ago." He closed his eyes briefly. 2 weeks. He's known for 2 weeks and said nothing. He stood quietly for a moment, absorbing that. Then he said, "He wanted to understand who I am before deciding whether I was worth knowing." That is either the most extraordinary act of self-possession I have ever heard of, or he is braver than anyone I have met in 20 years of business. Possibly both. The front door opened. Jackson stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. His mother on one side of the room, Sebastian Harrington on the other, and 22 years of unspoken history filling every inch of the space between them. He stepped inside and closed the door. "How did you find out?" he said to Sebastian. "Daniel noticed. Then I looked at your file." He paused. "Your birth certificate." Jackson nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" Jackson looked at him steadily. "Because I needed to know who you actually are, not the version that made my mother leave, the version that exists right now." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "And?" Jackson considered. "And I think you've done the work of becoming someone different. I'm not saying the past didn't happen. I'm saying I see evidence that it isn't the whole story." Sebastian turned to look at Nadia. She was watching them both with an expression he could not entirely read. guarded and beneath the guard, something that might have been the beginning of relief. "I would like to know you," Sebastian said to Jackson, "as my son, not as a trainee, not as an asset or an extension of anything I'm building. As my son. I understand if that isn't something you want, but I want you to know I'm asking." Jackson looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at his mother. She gave him nothing. No direction, no lean, no rescue. His choice. Then he said, "I'd like that. I'd like to understand who you are, and I'd like to give you the chance to understand who I am." Something shifted in Sebastian's face then. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but something quieter. Something that looked like a man receiving something he had long since stopped believing he deserved. The weeks that followed were not easy and were not meant to be. Jackson transferred to a different mentor within the program. Both he and Sebastian agreed that the existing arrangement needed restructuring before it could become something honest. They began meeting outside of work, dinners at first, where the conversation was careful and the silences were long. Walks eventually, where the conversation became easier and the silences became comfortable. Slowly, in the way that real things grow, something began to take shape between them that neither of them had words for, yet but both of them recognized. Nadia kept her distance for the first month. She had rebuilt her life around her own edges, and she was not ready to blur them again. But Sebastian called her one evening, not to ask anything of her, not to reopen any argument, but simply to tell her that he had been thinking about the company's early years, and about the work she had contributed that no public record reflected, and about the fact that he intended to correct that, if she would permit it. She had told him it was 23 years too late. He had said, "Yes, but it's the right thing, and I should have done it long ago." She had hung up and sat in her kitchen for a very long time. Then she had called Jackson and told him that his father had called, and Jackson had said, "I know, I told him to." She had laughed, which surprised her. He laughed too. 6 months after the truth came into the open, the three of them sat together at Nadia's kitchen table. A meal she had cooked. Wine Sebastian had brought. A quiet evening that would have been unimaginable from the vantage point of any earlier version of their lives. "I have something to tell you both," Jackson said. He had been offered the opportunity to lead a new initiative within Harrington Global, a division dedicated to sustainable investment frameworks for underserved markets. Exactly the kind of work, Nadia noted with a quiet that bordered on awe, that she had proposed in the 3rd year of her marriage and been told was not a priority. "That's extraordinary," she said. Sebastian nodded. "The proposal was approved by the board on its merits alone. I recused myself entirely." The pride in his voice was careful, measured, and entirely real. Jackson looked between them. His mother's precision and her resilience. His father's vision and the humility it had taken him decades to earn. The road ahead would not be simple. There were still silences between them that held old weight. There were still questions that had no clean answers. But there was also something real. Something built not on the story they had been given, but on the truth they had chosen to walk toward. "I used to think," Jackson said, "that family was the thing you were handed at the beginning." He was quiet for a moment. "I think now it might be the thing you earn, slowly, by choosing to stay in the difficulty instead of walking away from it." Nadia reached across the table and took his hand. After a moment, Sebastian extended his own. 3 people, connected by blood and by choice, by silence and by the things finally spoken. Not a simple family, not a perfect one, but theirs. Entirely, honestly, undeniably theirs. "Thank you for spending this time with this story. If it moved you, if it made you think about the secrets we carry and the truths that eventually find their way into the light, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Every story shared here is a reminder that the most complicated families are often the most real ones, and that it is never too late to build something honest from whatever has been broken. There are more stories waiting for you. Stay with us. There is a particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something, but from never knowing what you missed. Jackson had grown up with the ordinary grief of fatherlessness. The empty chair at school events, the questions he had learned not to ask, the careful way he shaped himself around an absence he could not name. But sitting in his car that night after leaving his mother's kitchen table, he understood that he had also spent 22 years grieving something he did not yet have a word for. Not a man, a possibility. The version of his life in which someone who looked like him, thought like him, moved through the world the way he moved through the world, had been present from the beginning. He sat with that grief for a long time before he drove home. He let it exist. Then he filed it in the place where he kept the things that were true and painful and necessary, and he went to sleep. He arrived at Harrington Global the following morning, the same way he had arrived every morning for the past 4 weeks. Early, prepared, present. He did not know what Sebastian had learned or what he planned to do with what he had learned. He knew only that he had made a decision about his own conduct. He would be exactly who he was, and he would let whatever was coming come at its own pace. Sebastian, when he arrived at 6:50, 5 minutes later than his usual time, which Jackson had already come to understand was unusual, was quieter than normal. Not cold, not distant, quiet in the way of someone doing a great deal of interior work. He directed the morning professionally, asked good questions, made precise decisions. But twice during the morning briefing, he stopped mid-sentence and looked at Jackson with that expression. Not recognition exactly, more like the near recognition of someone trying to place a melody they cannot quite recall. They worked through the afternoon without addressing anything except the work itself. And the work was, as it had always been between them, uncommonly efficient. Two minds solving the same problems from the same angles at the same speed. Jackson had once thought this was simply compatibility. He thought now that it might be inheritance. At 4 in the afternoon, Sebastian asked him to stay after the junior staff had left. Jackson sat across from him at the long desk and waited. Sebastian, for the first time since Jackson had known him, seemed before speaking them. "I have been doing this work for 30 years, he said finally. "I have interviewed thousands of people, hired hundreds, worked closely with perhaps a dozen whom I would describe as genuinely exceptional. What I have experienced in the past 4 weeks with you is something I have not experienced before. Not a professional similarity. Something else. Something I could not account for." He paused. "Until yesterday." Jackson held his gaze and said nothing. "I need to ask you something," Sebastian said, "and I need you to understand that whatever you answer, your position here, your future in this program, and my regard for what you have accomplished are not contingent on it. I am asking as a person, not as your employer." Jackson nodded. "Is Nadia Carver your mother?" The question, spoken plainly in that quiet room at the end of an ordinary working day, rearranged something in the air. "Yes," Jackson said. Sebastian sat back. He did not say anything for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was very controlled and very careful. "And your father?" He stopped. He started again. "There is no father listed on your birth certificate." Jackson said, "No." Sebastian looked at him. Jackson looked back. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing on opposite sides of a door, both of them knowing it was about to open. "I need to speak with your mother," Sebastian said quietly. "I know," Jackson said. "I'll let her know you're coming." He had called Nadia from the street outside the building. He had told her, with the particular gentleness of someone who understood that they were about to deliver something irreversible, that Sebastian had asked the question, that she should expect him tonight, that it was time. She had been silent on the line for long enough that he had checked to make sure the call was still connected. Then she had said, "All right," and she had sounded, for the first time in a very long time, as though a weight had shifted. In the days after Sebastian visited her apartment, Nadia found herself examining the decision she had made 23 years ago with fresh eyes. She had examined it many times before. In the long silences of Jackson's childhood, in the moments she had seen the onboarding list with his name on it, in the hours between knowing she should tell him and finding that she could not. She had always found the same conclusion. She had done what she believed was right, given who she was and who Sebastian had been at the time. But there was a question she had never been able to answer to her own satisfaction, and it sat in her now with a new and uncomfortable weight. Had she made that decision for Jackson? Or had she made it, at least in part, for herself? To close a door completely? To ensure that the life she was building could not be pulled back toward the one she had escaped? She had told herself it was protection. She had believed it was protection. And perhaps it had been. But protection and control were closer to each other than she had always wanted to admit, and the honest part of her. The part that Sebastian had once called formidable and clear-eyed could no longer pretend she did not see the distance between them. She did not arrive at easy answers. She did not expect to. But she began to allow herself to sit with the harder question. Not whether she had been justified, but whether the person she had been protecting all along had deserved to make some of those choices for himself. Jackson, meanwhile, was building something that had no established blueprint. He met with Sebastian every week, outside of work, at a small restaurant near the financial district that had no connection to Harrington Global or to any version of either of their professional lives. The first 3 meetings were careful. They talked about business, about the industry, about the work. They circled around the personal the way you circle around something you are not yet sure you want to touch. Then in the 4th meeting, Sebastian had ordered coffee. Black, no sugar. And Jackson had done the same, and they had both noticed, and something had shifted in the room. Sebastian had smiled unexpectedly, the first real smile Jackson had seen on him outside of a meeting room. It changed his face entirely. Jackson had seen that smile in a mirror his whole life and had never understood where it came from until now. They talked for 4 hours that evening about Sebastian's early years, the ones that had happened before the company, before the success, before the gradual calcification of a person who had started out with genuine hunger to build something that mattered. About Jackson's childhood, not the difficult parts first, but the ordinary ones. The books he had read, the problems he had been drawn to, the particular way he had always experienced the world as a series of systems that could be understood, and if you were patient and precise enough, improved. Sebastian had listened to this with an expression that Jackson could not initially name. He named it eventually. Recognition. Not of a version of himself he was proud of. Recognition of the root of something he had taken a very wrong direction with, in someone who had been given the chance to take a better one. I should have been there, Sebastian said. Near the end of that evening, he said it without the armor of explanation or context. Just the fact of it, plain and unqualified. I should have been there, and I wasn't, and I cannot fix that. Jackson had nodded. I know. Then, but you're here now. That counts for something. It has to count for something, or there's no point in any of this. Sebastian had looked at him across the table for a long moment. You are a much more generous person than I deserve. Jackson had said, I didn't do it for you. I did it because I don't want to spend my life carrying a grievance I had the option to put down. There was a Saturday morning, about 3 months into this slow reconstruction, when Jackson arrived at his mother's apartment to find that Sebastian had called her the evening before. Not to discuss the past, to ask her directly and without condition whether she would be willing to consult on a project Harrington Global was developing. A sustainable investment framework for post-conflict economies, the kind of work she had proposed 20 years ago and been told was not relevant, the kind of work she had quietly built her independent practice around ever since. He had not framed it as reparation, he had framed it as, this work needs someone who has been thinking about it longer than anyone else I know, and that person is you, and I would be grateful if you would consider it. She had told Jackson about it with the careful neutrality of someone who did not want to be seen to be softening. Jackson had said, Are you going to say yes? She had looked out the window for a long time. I don't know yet, she said. I need to sit with it. He had said, You've been sitting with things for 23 years, Mom. You're allowed to do something. She had laughed. It was the same laugh Sebastian had first fallen in love with at a birthday dinner table 3 decades ago. Unguarded and entirely itself. Jackson heard it and felt for perhaps the first time that the 3 separate lives that had been moving in parallel for 22 years might finally be beginning to share the same direction. Not converging, not erasing what each of them had built alone, just moving alongside each other, At last. The evening 6 months later, when they sat together at the kitchen table, and Jackson told them about the social impact division, Nadia reached across and took his hand as she had done his whole life, whenever he had achieved something that moved her beyond words. Sebastian, after a moment's pause, extended his own hand toward them both. He did not offer a speech. He did not wrap the moment in language. He simply stayed in it. And the staying was the most different thing about the man who sat in Nadia's kitchen compared to the man who had stood in that champagne-lit gala room 30 years ago and reduced his wife to a footnote in his own success story. None of them spoke for a while. The kitchen was quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet when everyone in them is exactly where they are supposed to be. Then Jackson said, "I've been thinking about what it means to build something. Not a company, a life." His voice was thoughtful, unhurried. "I used to think it meant deciding what you wanted and not stopping until you had it." He paused. "I think now it means knowing when to stop, when to look at what you've broken and decide to repair it instead of replace it." Sebastian looked at him. Nadia looked at him. He looked between them both. "We broke something," he said. "All of us, in different ways, for different reasons, with different amounts of understanding of what we were doing. And we're here, at this table. That means something." "It means everything," Nadia said quietly. Sebastian nodded and did not try to add to that. They were not a conventional family. They never would be. There was too much history, too much distance, too many years between what they might have been and what they had actually become. But they were real, real in the way that only the most tested things are real. Shaped by difficulty, stripped of pretense, honest in a way that the comfortable version of their lives could never have been. Thank you for being here for this story. If it moved you in any way, if it made you think about the secrets we protect and the truths that find us regardless, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Every story here is a reminder that families are not only the ones we are given, they are also the ones we have the courage to rebuild, long after everything has gone quiet. In the small, honest hours, at a kitchen table with cold coffee and too much history and just enough grace to try again, more stories are waiting. Come back for them. We'll be here. There is something Nadia often returned to in the months that followed. A memory from Jackson's early childhood, when he was perhaps 7 years old and had asked her, with the directness that small children have before the world teaches them to soften their questions, whether his father had ever wanted to meet him. She had given him the careful answer she had prepared. She had watched his face take in that answer and file it away somewhere quiet and deep. And then he had asked what was for dinner, and the subject had closed, and she had told herself that the closing was a mercy. She understood now that it had not been a mercy, it had been a postponement. The question had never really closed. It had simply gone underground, the way living things go underground in winter. Not gone, not finished, only waiting. Jackson had carried it the whole time. She could see that now, looking back across the years, in the way he had never quite stopped glancing at doors when they opened in public places, in the way he had sometimes gone very quiet at the dinners of friends who had fathers present, not sad, exactly, not resentful, but attentive in the way of someone listening for a sound they have never heard and are not entirely sure they would recognize. He had always been waiting. He had simply been too kind to tell her so. She told him this one evening, sitting on the steps outside her building while the sun went down, about 2 weeks after the kitchen table dinner. He had sat with it quietly for a moment. Then he had said, "I knew you were protecting me. I always knew that. That's why I never pushed." She had looked at him. "I think I was protecting myself too," she said, "at least some of it." He had nodded. "I know." He had paused. "I also know that what you built for us, on your own, for all those years, that was real, that was love. One thing doesn't cancel out the other." She had not been able to respond to that for quite a long time. Sebastian in those same months was engaged in his own kind of reckoning. He had spent 30 years building a company that was, by every external measure, a success. He had spent considerably longer building a version of himself that he had believed was necessary for that success. Decisive, certain, focused to the exclusion of almost everything that was not the work. He understood now, with the clarity that only arrives after substantial loss, that he had confused the instrument for the thing itself. The company had always been a means to something. He had forgotten, somewhere in the acceleration, what the something was. He began to make changes at Harrington Global that were noticed by people who had worked there for a long time. Not dramatic changes, structural ones. More transparent crediting of collaborative work in official communications. A formal review of the company's early history that acknowledged the contributions of people who had been part of the foundation, but absent from the record. A mentorship restructuring that gave trainees genuine decision-making exposure rather than the observation-only format that had existed for years. These things happened quietly, as real changes do, but they were noticed. Olivia Park, who had worked at Harrington Global for 11 years and had developed a precise internal compass for the difference between performance and substance, mentioned to a colleague one afternoon that she didn't know what had happened in the last 6 months, but the company felt different, more honest somehow, less like a performance of a certain kind of success and more like something that was actually trying to be what it claimed to be. Her colleague had asked what she thought had caused it. She had thought about it for a moment. "I think," she said, "someone reminded him of something he forgot a long time ago." She did not know exactly how accurate that was. Jackson threw himself into the social impact division with the same precision and hunger he brought to everything. The work was difficult and necessary and entirely his own. He built a small team of people who had the same instinct he did, that the structures determining who had access to capital and who did not were not natural laws, but human choices, and could therefore be changed by other human choices made with more care and more intention. He called his mother twice a week. He had dinner with Sebastian once every week or two. He was, by his own account, exactly where he had always been trying to get to, and the getting there had taken a road he could not have predicted and would not have chosen. And that was all right. That was, in fact, the most honest thing about it. There is no clean ending to a story that is still being lived. Nadia knew that. Sebastian knew it. Jackson, the most clear-eyed of the three, had perhaps always known it. Real families, real reconciliations, real reconstructions of broken things do not resolve neatly into silence. They continue. They have difficult weeks and good ones. They carry the weight of what was not said and discover, slowly, the relief of what is being said now. They are imperfect, ongoing, and precisely as real as the work put into them. But there was one moment, about 8 months after everything had shifted, that Nadia returned to often in the years that followed. She had been walking through the lobby of a building she had no particular reason to be in. She had come to deliver some consulting documents, nothing significant. And she had passed a window that reflected the lobby interior. And she had seen in that reflection Sebastian and Jackson standing together near the entrance, talking about something she could not hear. Sebastian had said something. Jackson had responded, and then they had both laughed. The same laugh, the same exact rhythm, the same involuntary quality, the laugh that belonged to both of them and had come from the same source and had been living in her kitchen for 22 years without her ever knowing where it had originated. She had stood at that window for a moment, looking at the reflection. She was not in it. This was not her scene to be in, and she found standing there that she did not mind that. She found, in fact, that there was something in it that felt very close to peace, something that said, what was broken is not fully healed, and may never be, but it is no longer just broken. It is becoming something else, something smaller and more honest, and, in the way of most honest things, more durable. She had walked on. She had a meeting to get to. She had work of her own. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found something true in it, something that spoke to the things we bury and the people we protect, and the moments when the truth arrives, regardless of whether we prepared for it, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, like the video. Subscribe to this channel if you want to keep hearing stories about real love, real loss, and the remarkable human capacity to keep trying. Because that is what these stories are about. Not perfection, not easy resolution. The trying, always the trying. We'll see you in the next one.